We now go by video link to the Chairman of the Treasury Select Committee, Mel Stride.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you, and I broadly welcome this budget. I say that also aware that the devil is always in the detail of budgets, and we very much look forward to welcoming my right honourable friend to the Treasury Select Committee on Thursday of next week to look at that detail in more detail. I totally applaud the measures that the Chancellor has taken in extending the bridge of support, the bridge between the crisis to the recovery. I think the measures he has taken around furlough, around support for the self-employed, the extension of the VAT reduction, business rates relief, etc., all of that is most welcome. I also very much welcome, as I and the Treasury Select Committee have been pressing for some time, the targeting elements that my right honourable friend has introduced as we come through this recovery. There's no doubt that certain parts of the economy will pick up quicker than others. Some businesses will do better than others. And so I welcome the 30% turnover threshold that my right honourable friend has introduced so that he can more accurately target the relief where it is needed. And that goes also for what I understand of his announcements around grants and, of course, the VAT reduction extension that will help particularly hard-pressed sectors. I also welcome the investment that he has announced in areas of the country, many of which will have suffered particularly during the crisis. And I think that is also welcome targeting. If I could turn briefly to the so-called excluded, those who have fallen through the gaps of support hitherto. I am a little disappointed not to have heard something by way of support for those directors working through their own limited companies, paying themselves by way of dividend, and yet not having those dividends counted towards their entitlement for furlough. There have been new ideas explored by the committee, and I would hope, even at this late stage, that the Chancellor would consider some of those ideas with the committee next week. I was, however, extremely pleased to see that the new self-assessment tax information that has been taken on board right up until, in fact, I think the Chancellor said last night, will be taken into account in helping many of those who would otherwise have fallen through the gaps of support, some 600,000 in total. I wanted to focus, Madam Deputy Speaker, just on three important areas for business and jobs and comment on what the Chancellor had to say in that respect. The first is corporate debt. The situation is that the data shows that larger businesses have a great deal of cash in the bank, and that's perhaps not surprising that they've been cautious, that they've received quite a lot of support from government, and of course, a lot of them have not been investing. However, amongst small and medium-sized enterprises, the picture is less clear, and there is a concern that I have that many of those businesses will struggle with the level of the debt that they have and will not be growing when we want them to be creating the jobs of the future, but actually will be focusing on deleveraging their balance sheets. And I would like to see something from the Chancellor as to how that particular problem might be addressed. If it is not, the risk here is that many of these SMEs will go out of business and markets will become more concentrated and less competitive as a consequence. On investment, I was hugely encouraged by what my right honourable friend said about the super deduction. My own view was that there should be an increase in the annual investment allowance. It seems to me that this goes significantly beyond that. The devil will be in the detail, but certainly if the kind of projections for investment that my right honourable friend has just outlined by way of the OBR's figures are correct, as I understood them, that this will be a huge shot in the arm for corporate UK, and very welcome. I welcome the 3-year loss carryback arrangements, also something the committee has pressed for. My third point would be around skills. I've been very impressed with all the announcements that have been made around encouraging apprenticeships, and there was more in the budget statement just now, the Kickstart scheme. It is imperative that we get this right and that we maximise the efficiency of the transfer of parts of the labour force from those parts of the economy and businesses that are contracting into those that are expanding. And I think the Treasury needs to play a very proactive role in making sure that those schemes are successful. One of the big tests I set in my mind for my right honourable friend's budget was to what degree he navigated successfully the requirement not to put up taxes too early and choke off growth, but at the same time making it very clear to the markets that he and the government are serious about dealing with the deficit and debt in the more medium term. And I have to say, once again, I've been pretty impressed with what I have heard. I want to see the detail, but it seems to me that the tax increases and the threshold freezes that my right honourable friend has announced do not kick in straight away, but he has charted a clear roadmap for how those taxes and thresholds will be dealt with between now and the end of this Parliament. If I could just say, Madam Deputy Speaker, on the issue of corporation tax, that is quite a hike from 19% to 25%. However, we still will remain internationally competitive, and I believe that President Biden, during in his campaign for the presidency, suggested that US rates might rise from 21 to 28%. So I think on balance, it seems to me that this is a reasonable move, given that none of the possibilities are particularly palatable, and I welcome the carve out for the small businesses through the small profit rate. It was pleasing to hear from my right honourable friend that the OBR's current projections have improved, and that we're hopefully going to get back to pre-pandemic levels of economic output 6 months earlier than previously was thought back in November. But of course, we still, as he has identified, face a huge challenge going forward, not just around COVID, Madam Deputy Speaker, but also the issue that we will have a smaller economy going forward, less taxes that will be able to be raised. And of course, we have demographic pressures going way out into the future with an increasingly elderly population and the pressures on our finances that will bring. And what my right honourable friend knows is that it is critical that we deal in a timely manner with these pressures, or interest rates will rise. And as he has stated, a 1% rise means an eye-watering £25 billion increase in the cost of servicing our debt. And that brings me to the principles that he has set out today, the principle of not borrowing to fund day-to-day expenditure at some point in the future, and also having an eye to seeing the level of debt as a percentage of GDP decreasing through time. I think those are welcome signals from my right honourable friend. I wanted to turn briefly now to, Madam Deputy Speaker, an issue that I think is an underestimated threat and has not been discussed enough in an economic context, and that is of a return of inflation. We know that inflation, if it increases and spikes up, and Andy Haldane, the chief economist at the Bank of England, has been pointing to this risk recently, that the Bank of England would need to tighten monetary policy to try and keep inflation under control. You would have bond markets in which the government and the Bank of England potentially were both sellers in that market, with increased upward pressure on interest rates and all that would follow. Inflation may come through increased friction in global trade, and we've seen increases in friction in trade with the EU 27 as a consequence of Brexit. It could come through the exchange rate, although the movements recently have been in a positive direction as the virus is being clamped down on, and our prospects have improved relative to other economies. But it could come through increases in energy costs, price of oil, and indeed the unwinding of some of the tax cuts, for example, those relating to VAT. But it could also come between the interplay between the supply and demand side of the economy as we recover. On the supply side, it remains uncertain how quickly companies will bounce back. We know that many of them being severely damaged. And on the demand side, it is also the case that we won't know at this stage the extent to which consumers will re-engage with the economy in a way that they did pre the pandemic, even though the virus is diminishing. And we also don't know what's going to happen to the huge amount of effectively enforced savings that has occurred in the economy, as people have not been able to engage with the economy in the usual fashion, perhaps up to, I believe the Bank of England has suggested 200 or 300 billion by the summer. If a lot of that goes back into the economy quickly, it will have a huge stimulus effect. If very little does, then clearly the opposite will be the case. And so I think it's absolutely right that my right honourable friend is ready and prepared to use the fiscal levers as appropriate over the coming months. And if he comes back to the House of Commons many, many times to do so, I think that should be seen as a position of strength, not weakness. So I wish my right honourable friend well. The committee will continue to be critical of him where I think it's appropriate, but also supportive of him in our common endeavour of putting the economy back on track. So could I conclude, Madam Deputy Speaker, by broadly welcoming this budget? It comes against a backdrop of one of the worst economic crises outside of wartime. And yet there is hope that springs, Madam Deputy Speaker, from the past, from the strengths that we held going into this crisis of strong and stable financial institutions, of record levels of employment, of the hard-won improvements to our public finances. But now it springs also, it seems to me, from the future, from the thousands of men and women, our scientists, our health workers, our volunteers, who appear to be on the brink of little short of a miracle, the wholesale turnaround in our country's fortunes due to vaccination. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, in broad terms, can I welcome my right honourable friend's budget today, but may I conclude by saluting each and every one of them.